This is actually the best bio written about Theodore Judah. My name is Chuck Spinks. I'm a retired civil engineer. I'm also a docent down at the California State Railroad Museum, and that got me interested in researching the Transcontinental Railroad, and particularly from the perspective of a civil engineer, which most historians take a different perspective, and that resulted in some conclusions that are different than a lot of the histories, and that'll be shown in this presentation. Theodore Judah, a brilliant civil engineer with a fantastic dream. So Theodore Judah, born in Bridgeport, Connecticut in 1826. His father was an Episcopal minister. Family moved to Troy when Theodore was a child. While there in Troy, he attended Rensselaer Institute, currently called Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, but he only attended for 1 year when he was 11 years old. His father died, though, at about that time, and his mother moved from Troy to New York City. So the young Theodore was on his own, but he started his engineering career at age 11. He left school and went to work for the Troy and Schenectady Railroad. Probably started out in a survey crew, which is how most civil engineers started their careers in those days. After the Troy and Schenectady Railroad, he went to the work for the Connecticut River Railroad, the New Haven, Hartford, and Greenfield, Massachusetts. While he was in Greenfield, he met his future wife, Anna Pierce, while he was working at the New Haven and Hartford Railroad. Anna and Theodore were married on May 10th, 1849, exactly 20 years before the Gold Spikes ceremony in Promontory, Utah, which was May 10th, 1869. So the young couple moved to Niagara Falls, where Anna's parents, John and Eliza Pierce, sold some property that they owned to Theodore. But what he did, he probably resold it and bought a lot overlooking the gorge of the Niagara River downstream from the falls, and built a cottage for themselves, Anna and Theodore. It overlooked the gorge on one side and the Lewiston Railroad on the other side. While he was in Niagara Falls, he did other projects. The Lewiston Railroad was one that he was asked to help with, and was actually hired probably as a consultant to do that work. And one of the documents we have is a copy of his business card advertisement for his consulting business. The date we have on it is 1852. Like most experienced civil engineers at the time, most of their work was done as contract, not as employees of the railroads. The demand for civil engineers was so high that they moved from project to project as needed. One of the projects he was hired to do in Niagara Falls was the Oakwood Cemetery. The original cemetery was downtown, but the railroad being built through Niagara Falls was right across where the cemetery was. So he designed a layout of a new cemetery. One of the comments from a magazine, the Western New York Heritage Magazine, credited Judah with a type of nonlinear park design that several years later was promoted by Frederick Law Olmsted. So he was definitely a free thinker. Well, Charles Lincoln Wilson had an idea for a railroad in Sacramento, but he needed a civil engineer. It was suggested that he go east and find a civil engineer experienced in railroads. He contacted a friend of his, Governor Seymour of New York. Governor Seymour also knew some of the engineers in the area, including a friend, not his brother, Silas Seymour, who is part of the Robinson, Seymour and Company civil engineering and construction firm. Theodore had worked for Seymour in the Buffalo and Niagara Falls Railroad. And when he recommended that Wilson hire him, he talked to Judah and was very impressed. Even though he was young, he already had 17 years of experience with railroads. So they went to California and moved there on May 4th, 1854. They traveled with his mother, Mary Jane Judah, and his sister, His brother Charles had already moved there in 1849. He was a very prominent attorney in San Francisco. His younger brother, Edward, also a civil engineer, joined Judah there, but we don't know when he showed up there. So he went to work surveying for the railroad. He opened an office in the B.F. Hastings building. And those of you familiar with Old Sacramento, familiar with that building, it has the Wells Fargo Museum, the ground floor. This is a plan of the improvements made by state parks. It shows the Supreme Court room at one end, which was where Edwin Crocker served as a Supreme Court Justice. In the offices, one of those would have been T.D. Judah and Company, his consulting engineering firm. In less than a month, he completed his survey, and so a contract was signed with Robertson, Seymour and Company, the same one that he had been involved with in New York State. In January, the Bank of Lucas Turner and Company purchased some stock, and the bank manager, William Sherman, became a vice president of the Sacramento Valley Railroad. Construction started February 12th. Folsom replaces Wilson as the president at that time, and interestingly, both Folsom and Sherman were classmates at West Point previously. Well, the things weren't going well in the sale of shares for the railroad. They did not have enough money to pay the contractor when they submitted a bill for over $381,000. The difficulty ended up being solved when the firm of Robertson Seymour Company, the contractor, was given a deed of trust, and they essentially became the owners and operators of the railroad construction. It's unclear when Judah left the service of the Sacramento Valley Railroad. We don't know if he was a paid employee or a contract employee through his consulting firm. But as soon as Robertson Seymour took over, J.P. Robinson and Lester Robinson were both civil engineers. So J.P. Robinson became the chief engineer of the railroad. They didn't need Judah at that point. The ring here is now at the Union Pacific Museum in Council Bluffs, but it was made from gold that was removed from one of the projects of the railroad. And it was given to Judah by Anna on his 29th birthday. Judah, as a consultant, was doing other jobs, including trying to make money through the new town of Folsom, and he was hoping to invest money and make some money out of property sales once the railroad came to town, but it didn't work out. Now, going back to his consulting firm, Judah probably started this firm as soon as he landed. There are records that show it being listed in some of the lists of firms in Sacramento, in the San Francisco-Sacramento Railroad. He worked there as a chief engineer in 1856. This later became a real railroad, the California Pacific. This is dated 15 days before his first trip back east. And this is a report from the same railroad preliminary survey, selling it as a potential beginning for the Pacific Railroad. All of his thoughts were Pacific Railroad. In his early explorations, he was exploring in the mountains in between the contract work he was doing. And this is a map of the public surveys. It's interesting in that it shows no surveys in the Sierra Nevadas except for this, the line along the South Fork, which was the wagon road to the Carson Valley. In his first trip back east on March 5th, he went back to try to work Congress and see if he can get some railroad bill passed. So he spent a full 2 years back east with Anna in both the 34th and the 35th Congress. And during that time, he published a nice little book that described a practical plan for building the Pacific Railroad. This was published at his own expense in 1857. He gave copies to all the members of Congress. It had quite a bit of detail, but the biggest message that it had was a detailed survey was needed in order to assess the cost and the viability of a railroad from Sacramento to the east. So he returns in March 1858. He worked with Wilson again, this time with the California Central Railroad, probably as a consultant, and worked also for several other railroads. Most of them didn't come to anything, but it expanded his knowledge of the area through his surveying and research. And this is one of the California Central projects. The bridge was actually built in 1858, even though it wasn't used until 1860, and it was done to a wooden truss arch bridge design standard developed by S.W. Hall. It's all wood. No, the only metal in there are the connections. So it ended up being its downfall. So here's the California Eastern Extension. This is something he pushed as part of an expansion of the California Central. He did it with Wilson. It's a separate little railroad. He surveyed, but it was never built. See Auburn over here on the right. He sold it as a potential route to Grass Valley, Nevada City, although his plan was to carry it over the Sierra Nevada. It's another interesting drawing. It's hard to decipher, but it does show an early railroad where he did some surveying. It's leaving Sacramento and essentially following the route up to Gritter's Ranch, Roseville. And so he was familiar with that route. This didn't come to anything, but it, again, he was becoming more and more familiar with the alternatives for a line over the Sierra. He had convinced the legislature to organize a Pacific Railroad Convention. It was held in San Francisco in September of 1859. The convention supported a central route and appointed Judah as an accredited agent representing the convention. So he traveled again to DC to push again for an act of Congress. He was working with Congressman John Birch, and he and Anna created a Pacific Railroad Museum, a room in the old Pacific Vice President's office, where they laid out her artwork and his drawings for all of the members of Congress to review. They met with President Buchanan. They pushed for the central route. Now, at the time, the only central route defined was from the Army surveys of the 1854, 1855, which went way north of the Sierra, but it was still a central route, and that was the one they pushed. This is a map that was prepared as part of those surveys. The surveys were done by the Army, and this shows the three routes: the northern route up through Washington, the central route, which came into California in the north part of the state, and the southern route. On his return, he recognized that there were two major things he needed to do. He needed to survey and map a route that he could sell to Congress, and he needed to organize a railroad company so they would be ready to go as soon as something was approved by Congress. This is interesting. This is just this is a plaque, and part of the problem of any historian is the sources that you use. This was actually located near Folsom Auburn Road, and it is about the Sacramento Placer Nevada Railroad. It's all wrong. Judah had actually nothing to do with this railroad, and it's a mystery why this came about, but J.P. Robinson, who we saw before, was actually the chief engineer of this railroad. So after returning in July, he wrote a report on his trip as an accredited agent and submitted that to the people that had sent him, as well as to the newspapers. And as an agent of the Sacramento Valley in one of his trips, they mentioned he is offering liberal inducements for Teamsters to load their wagons at Folsom rather than in Sacramento. That's interesting because at the time there was some dissension between Judah and the old Sacramento Valley Railroad people, the Robinsons. I think that actually that was been overplayed by historians. So his railroad reconnaissance surveys, he went up the mountains again, looked at alternative routes, one through Georgetown, one through Lake Pass, which is now Donner Pass, one through Hennis Pass. Each of those he had locals accompany him. And Georgetown, Mr. McKinney, Lake Pass, he had D.W. Strong, and in the Hennis Pass, he had Charles Marsh, another civil engineer from Nevada City. Some of the histories claim he discovered a route. He didn't discover anything new. He was familiar with it. What he did discover was something perfect for a railroad. It offered a constant grade up the divide all the way to the summit. And that is key. That is probably the most important characteristic of this route in Judah's mind and as a civil engineer and looking at it from the perspective of operating a railroad. So Judah and Strong decided they would start selling shares and created the new Central Pacific Railroad. And their efforts extended into the towns surrounding the area. As a result of his decision that this route was the perfect route over the Sierra Nevada, he created a marketing document for investors called the Central Pacific Railroad Company of California. And it describes this practical line over the Sierra Nevada. So he goes to San Francisco, where the big money is, with his marketing pamphlet to try to sell all of his shares. Not successful and very disappointed. The San Francisco investors could get much higher short-term gains from other investments. Also, much of San Francisco money was Southern Democrat. They did not support a railroad in the central route. They wanted a Southern route. So when did the first meeting take place with the future associates? Judah was in San Francisco probably late November 1860. He returns to Sacramento probably in December. Lauren Upson, the editor of the Sacramento Daily Union and a fan of the Pacific Railroad and Theodore, mentioned in his January 4th article, up to this time, there has been no effort to obtain subscriptions in Sacramento. So we know he hadn't been selling before then. And since Stanford leaves in January 19th for the East Coast, that is a narrow window when all of these meetings actually took place. And one of the key items here, Stanford was there just for a short time, and his friend James Bailey, who was a very good friend of Theodore Judah and one of his supporters, had suggested that Stanford meet with Theodore. They did. They met in his house. They discussed it. Later, Stanford discussed it with Huntington, and eventually the group of them decided to fund a more detailed survey. And the 6 of them with Judah combined to help support this first instrument survey. So he heads up to the mountains with the funds now available. During that time, Stanford was nominated for governor. In June 28th, 1861, the incorporation document was filed with the state. Judah signs the document, so we assume he came back from his surveying for that document. This is a copy of the Articles of Incorporation. It's hard to read because you can see through the parchment paper, but these documents list the directors of the new Central Pacific Railroad: Stanford president, Huntington VP, Hopkins treasurer, Judah chief engineer, James Bailey secretary, and then Crocker, Marsh, Strong, and Booth as directors. This is the other side with the signatures of the original incorporators of the Central Pacific Railroad, 31 signatures. Of those 31, only 6 purchased the 150 shares. Those were Bailey, Hopkins, Huntington, Judah, Stanford, and Crocker. 2 purchased 50 shares, Marsh and Strong. Interestingly, you needed to have at least 50 shares in order to be a director. They wanted to be directors, so they purchased the minimum. Of those total shares, only 10% down was required, but these 5 businessmen, Bailey, Hopkins, Huntington, Stanford, and Crocker, owned 60% of the shares at that point. So they were already controlling the operation. And this is a map that Judah drew. This is all done by hand, actually a work of art. It was probably for his trip back east to push again for the passing of an act for the railroad. And it's interesting in that it does show, it's hard to read here, but you can see the red line that goes over the mountains. At this time, the line still started from Lincoln. It didn't go through Newcastle until he came back and modified it. So this is first chief engineer's report. It describes the route. It describes also his success in finding a route across the mountains. It lists some of the pluses and minuses of the various routes. He also included a list of 31 numbered important items for selling the proposed route to investors. It's interesting, all of those items were important for people willing to invest and wanting to invest in the railroad, but really from an engineering perspective, only two of them were key. The elevation of line is maintained continuously to the summit, and a uniformly descending grade is maintained from the summit easterly to the Truckee. All of the rest were important, but these were the key engineering items relative to operating a railroad. As Judah leaves again to meet with Congress and try to get the passage of an act for the Pacific Railroad, he also had the advantage of being appointed clerk to the House Select Committee, clerk to the House Subcommittee on the Pacific Railroad, and secretary of the Senate Pacific Railroad Committee. This allowed him floor privileges in Congress in both Senate and the House. And as everyone knows, the Railroad Act passed July 1, 1862, signed by Lincoln. As he left Congress, they gave him this letter. This letter was in appreciation for his work in helping to pass the Railroad Act. It was signed by 44 representatives and 18 senators. So the Pacific Stockholders meeting on July 10th, 1862, in Judah's office in the Hastings building. Judah wasn't there. He was still back in Washington, but they held the meeting in his office. Officers still haven't received a copy of the act, so they don't know how to react to it yet, but they did re-elect the same officers and directors. So Judah's second engineer's report pretty much copied what was in the previous engineer's report, but had some new information on the route that he had laid out. Now it's interesting, newspapers from various towns and cities that wanted to build or to have the railroad go through them were complaining about this route. The newspapers tended to be fixated on the lowest passes without considering of how the line got there. And that is key because there are even historians today that claim there were lower passes. Why didn't he build over them? In September, less than a month after returning, he takes a group on a tour of alternative routes. The group includes Judah, Congressman Aaron Sargent, Civil Engineer Charles Marsh, and Collis Huntington. They first go up over Hennis Pass, and then Aaron Sargent drops out, and Marsh, Judah, and Huntington continue down the middle fork of the Feather River. There's a reason they spend the time on the Feather River. That is the only other route across the Sierra Nevada, which is a constant grade all the way up. So January 8th, 1863, the first throwing of dirt ceremony. Charles Crocker resigns from the board and forms Charles Crocker and Company Construction. That was one of the first things that got Judah upset with the organization he was now working with. He did not agree with someone involved doing the construction. They didn't have funds immediately available. They had to have 40 miles before they could get bonds. And the directors decided to use their own money. Judah doesn't have the funds to participate. So Judah's third and last chief engineer's report. This one's significant because this is also the point where he changes the route from going through Lincoln to following the ridge that it currently does up through Newcastle and through Auburn. These are the 5 routes, and these are the titles he gave to the 5 routes. Until I took the time to map them, they had never been mapped, although they had been described in some recent histories. This is a letter that Judah wrote just before he left on his final journey back east. It's to Sam Montague, his assistant chief engineer. You are hereby appointed resident engineer upon the Pacific Railroad and will assume charge of the engineering department and supervising the work during my absence. I believe this letter says he intended on returning, and there's some dispute on whether he did intend on returning to California. So only 3 months after he leaves the engineer's report, he leaves for the East again. He and Anna leave on October 3rd. While in Panama, either this trip across on the railroad, he contracts yellow fever from mosquito bite. He died in New York City on November 2nd, 1863. Now, the big question, was he planning on returning? Was he still employed by the Central Pacific Railroad? We know he wasn't happy. It was his railroad, and the board was not keeping him involved in corporate decisions. This is where he's buried now, in the plot of Anna Judah's family, the Pierce family. Anna was the administratrix, which is a woman that is an administrator of a will. It's interesting that all of the probate documents are available online. They're hard to read because they're all handwritten, over 100 pages, but it does appear that Judah's mother was competing with Anna for some of Theodore's inheritance. So that's the end of his life, but that's not the end of his story. In Anna's famous letter of 1889, this is one of the few sources of history we have on early Theodore Judah, and it is often quoted, and it's considered a primary source, which it is, but all primary sources require interpretation also. And it's the source of Crazy Judah. And Anna stated that he was railroad crazy, so often called. There are no newspaper articles, reports, or any evidence at the time that called him railroad crazy. In fact, he was looked upon as one of the railroad engineering experts of the period. Crazy Judah was a catchy phrase. So again, historians picked up on it, even though I don't think it was accurate at all. It was just her phrase describing what she felt at the time. And here's the monument we have today in Sacramento, dedicated in 1930. It's first located in front of the SP Depot, but now it's located at the foot of L Street and next to I-5. Another view of it, almost hidden, small park next to a garbage can. We'd very much like it to be someplace more prominent. The biggest event that impacted the history of California was the gold rush. But the second biggest event that impacted California was the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, that impact, a lot of things that we don't realize, that impact was even greater than most people know. The Southern Pacific shops. It wouldn't have been in Sacramento, which was a small town at the time. And of course, the SP shops were one of the biggest economic engines for the development of Sacramento. It was the biggest industrial complex west of the Mississippi. Other things, there would have been no Huntington Library and Art Museum in Southern California, no Crocker Art Museum in Sacramento. And even more important, there would be no Leland Stanford Junior University and no Silicon Valley. If Theodore Judah had not been around to push the Railroad Act in Congress in 1862, it probably would have been built by someone else. Probably later, it would have been built from the East Coast with Eastern money. The money that the associates put into this would have gone someplace else. The railroad would have been headquartered someplace other than California.